The lonely cowboy rode in town alone for supplies, but found a hungry bride begging for bread, and dust followed his horse like a shadow, curling into the wind with every step. The road to Riverside was nothing more than a line of broken stones stretched over dead grass and dry silence. No trees, no birds, just the groan of saddle leather and the slow creak of wagon wheels in the distance. Elijah rode in without hurry, his hat pulled low, coat frayed at the cuffs, and a day's silence worn across his face like a second skin. The town hadn't changed in years. 3 shops, a crooked church bell, and a saloon that coughed out men each evening like smoke from a dying chimney. Elijah's boots hit the dirt outside the general store. He tied his horse with gentle hands, touched its neck once, then turned for the wooden steps. But something caught in the corner of his eye. Near the alley beside the bakery, crouched against the brick wall, was a figure, small, slumped, and shaking. A woman, though barely more than a girl in size, with a torn veil slipping from her hair. Her dress was white once, now greyed with dirt and hunger. She held a hand out, not toward anyone, but toward the bread window, like a silent prayer. She didn't speak when he approached. She didn't lift her face, just sat there on her knees, one arm cradling her stomach, as if to hold it still. The shopkeeper inside shooed her earlier, he'd later learn. No coins, no crumbs, was all anyone offered her. Elijah stood still, boots half in shadow. He looked down. She was barefoot. The soles of her feet were raw and dusted with gravel. A fly circled her torn hem. She must have heard his breath shift, because her head tilted slightly. Not to face him, but to show she wasn't dead. Her cheek was bruised, her lips cracked, and tied loosely around her wrist, like a mockery of celebration, was a satin ribbon, the kind a bride might wear. She hadn't asked for help, but she was begging without words, and that was louder than any scream. Elijah didn't move at first. The sun burned down on the back of his neck, yet he felt cold. His hand twitched near his coat pocket, where he kept a few coins folded in cloth, but he didn't reach for them. Something about the girl's stillness, not frozen in fear but resigned, held him there. It was the kind of silence that followed after a scream had been used up. He looked away, toward the bakery window where warm bread sat in neat rows behind glass. He thought of his mother's kitchen, the way the smell of biscuits used to fill the house before his father came home angry. He thought of how his little sister used to hide under the table with her knees pulled tight, and how no one ever gave her a way out. Not even him. His boots shifted in the dust. That ribbon. That damn ribbon on her wrist. It reminded him of the one his wife wore the day they buried her. White lace, tucked into her hands like something pure, though nothing about her death had been. She'd been too thin by the end, too quiet. He'd held her hand at the doctor's and promised he'd make it back with medicine. But he'd come home late. He clenched his jaw, looked down again. The girl hadn't moved, not even to look up. Maybe she was used to being ignored. Maybe it was safer not to ask anymore. He turned to go. His boot hit the first step of the store porch. The bell above the door rang as someone came out. A man carrying sugar and nails, walking past like the girl wasn't even there. She flinched slightly, just once, when the man's shadow passed her, like a hunted dog. Elijah's fingers curled into fists. He stepped back off the porch. He crouched beside her without a word, slowly, not to startle. From his coat pocket, he took out the cloth-wrapped coins. Quietly, he placed them in her hand, curly, and her fingers around them with care, like he might break her if he wasn't gentle. Still, she didn't speak. But her breath caught, a small sound, almost like a gasp she swallowed too late. "I'll get the bread," he said, voice low. She nodded once, or maybe it was just a shiver. But it was enough. He stood up and went inside. He didn't owe her anything. He didn't know her name. But he knew what it meant to be left alone and hungry on the day that was supposed to be the best day of your life. And that was reason enough. By the time Elijah stepped out of the bakery with a loaf in hand, the girl was gone. His eyes scanned the alley, the road, the church steps across the square. Then he saw the ribbon. It lay in the dirt where she'd sat, trampled by a wagon wheel, a ribbon torn from her wrist, or maybe left on purpose. He followed his gut, not his boots. It led him toward the back of the stable, past the barrels and feed sacks, where the smell of sweat and horse dung covered more than just animals. He found her crouched behind a broken fence, her back to the wall, holding the bread like it was something sacred. She had not eaten it yet. She was just staring at it, chest heaving like someone holding off panic with shallow breaths. "You run from something," he said quietly. She looked up then, not in fear, in warning. "They'll come back," she whispered. "They went to get help. I wasn't supposed to leave." "Who?" She hesitated. "My uncles. 3 of them. Took my dowry. Said the man refused me. Said I was used up. They said I was their problem again." Her voice cracked. "I ran when they started drinking." Elijah felt something burn under his ribs. "You married?" She shook her head. "Sold. No vows. Just a dress. I don't think the man ever meant to take me. He just wanted to humiliate them. So they turned on me." Her hands shook now, but she gripped the bread tighter. "They'll kill me for shaming them." He crouched beside her, looking past the fence to the road. A wagon had appeared on the far edge of town, too fast for casual travel. Dust rose behind it like a snow. "Ignore." His jaw tensed. "Do they know where you are?" She nodded. "They know I'd beg at the bakery. Always said I was soft in the stomach and weak in the knees. They knew I'd crawl for bread." Elijah stood, reached for her hand. "Come with me. They'll follow. Let them try." She rose slowly, barefoot still, but this time her steps followed his. She tucked the bread under her arm like a child she didn't want to drop. The wagon grew closer. Elijah led her back to his horse, helped her mount, then climbed up behind. His coat wrapped around her shoulders. She trembled, but didn't speak. They rode out the back way, through brush and dried creek beds, the long way home. The wind cut sharp. The sky darkened too early. Behind them, a shout cracked across the open land. And that was the moment he knew this wasn't just charity. It was war. The cabin stood alone at the edge of the valley, weather-beaten and silent, with a porch that sagged in the middle like a tired back. Elijah hadn't brought anyone here in years. He barely brought himself. When they arrived, she didn't ask where they were or what would happen next. She just slid off the horse slowly, landing on bruised feet with a wince she tried to hide. Elijah tied the reins and lit the lamp inside. It flickered against the walls like nervous breath. He didn't say much. Neither did she. He cooked quietly, the way a man does when he's used to feeding only himself. She sat by the hearth, the bread still untouched in her lap. When he placed a tin plate of hot beans and salted jerky in front of her, she nodded once in thanks, but didn't eat until he took the first bite. Later, when the fire had settled and the wind howled low outside, she touched the ribbon now tied around her finger and asked, "Why'd you come back?" Elijah stirred the flames. "Didn't want to regret it." She looked at him. "Do you regret much?" He didn't answer. The next morning he showed her how to hold his rifle. Her hands were too small, her grip unsure, but she didn't flinch when he corrected her stance, guiding her shoulder with quiet patience. She missed the first few shots, then hit a tin can square. Her eyes lit up, but she said nothing. In the afternoon she swept the cabin, repaired a button on his shirt, took to warming his coffee in the mornings, never asked for anything in return. She found an old music box in a drawer and set it on the windowsill. It no longer played, but she cleaned it with a cloth anyway, humming a tune as if trying to remember how it used to sound. One night, when rain tapped the roof soft and steady, she pointed to the scar on his collarbone. He froze. Then, quietly, he said, "Left there by a man. I didn't stop soon enough." She nodded, then lifted her sleeve. A set of old bruises marked her wrist. "Mine came from the ones who thought I belonged to them." They sat in silence after that, each watching the other with new eyes. The fire crackled gently. Her head leaned against the doorframe. His coat rested across her shoulders. For a few hours, it felt like they had both found something neither of them had ever known. Not safety, maybe, but recognition. A place where pain wasn't a secret, and quiet company didn't feel like loneliness. And in that stillness, before the world came knocking again, something fragile and human began to bloom. They came at dusk. 3 riders, dust-covered and grim, their horses foaming at the mouth from the hard ride through the valley. Elijah saw them before she did. He stood by the corral, feeding the mare, when the wind shifted and carried voices, sharp, male, too confident for strangers. His eyes narrowed. His hand went to the rifle leaning against the fence. Inside the cabin, she was boiling water, humming softly. He stepped in, quiet, but certain. "They're here," he said. She froze. Her hands gripped the kettle too tight. "How many?" "3. The same you told me about." She nodded, her lips pale. "2 uncles, 1 cousin. The loudest one carries a rope. Said he'd drag me back for all to see." Elijah loaded the rifle. The click echoed like thunder in the small room. "You can still run," she whispered. "I've done enough running." When they arrived at the gate, the lead man dismounted first. Tall, wide, with a grey beard and a sneer shaped by liquor and hate. "We're here for the girl," he called out. "She's got no right to hide. She's property till our debt's repaid." Elijah stepped onto the porch. "She's not property," he said flatly. The man laughed. "You gonna marry her then? Take on her filth, her shame, her curse? She's already more woman than you'll ever be, man." The words cut, and the cousin raised his rifle. Elijah raised his own. Slow, deliberate. A long pause held the air hostage. "She belongs to us," the older man growled. "The law says—" "There's no law out here," Elijah interrupted. "Only men, and I ain't afraid of you." A beat passed. Then, unexpectedly, she stepped outside. Her hands were empty, but her face was not. "I'll go," she said softly. "Just don't hurt him." Elijah turned sharply. "No." But she walked forward, barefoot on the cold dirt, her shoulders trembling. The men smirked. The cousin moved to grab her arm. That's when Elijah stepped down and fired. The warning shot hit the dirt at the man's feet. The others flinched. "You touch her," Elijah said, his voice low and dark, "and I'll put the next one through your knee." The cousin hesitated. Then came the twist. Behind them, a 4th horse appeared. The sheriff. But instead of siding with the girl, he tipped his hat to her uncles. "She was sold proper," the sheriff said. "You're interfering with rightful property." Elijah's breath hitched. Betrayal hung thick. But he didn't lower his rifle. "She's not going back," he said. The sheriff raised his own gun. "Then you'll die protecting her?" Elijah glanced at her. She looked at him like he was already gone. He nodded once. "If I must." The standoff cracked in the breath between 2 heartbeats. A hawk cried overhead, slicing the silence. Then the cousin lunged. Elijah fired. The shot rang, out, sharp, and final. The man collapsed, screaming, clutching his thigh. The second uncle reached for his belt, but the girl moved faster than anyone expected. She grabbed the kettle from the fire and flung boiling water across his chest. He fell back, howling, clawing at his shirt. The older uncle hesitated. For the first time his sneer faltered. He looked from Elijah's rifle to the sheriff, who hadn't moved. The lawman's fingers were tight on his holster, but something in his eyes had changed. He wasn't reaching anymore, just watching, measuring. "Go home," Elijah said, voice steady. "All of you." The sheriff spat in the dirt, then slowly lowered his hand. "I didn't see nothing," he muttered, turning his horse around. The remaining uncle helped the wounded one onto a saddle. Neither said a word. The girl stood at the gate, smoke rising from the iron kettle beside her, her breath shallow but unbroken. No one looked back. When the dust cleared, only the wind remained. Elijah exhaled slowly. His hands trembled now that the danger had passed. He turned to her, but she wasn't crying. She stood still, arms at her sides, staring at the blood drying in the dirt. He walked to her, didn't speak, just took her hand, the same one that had once reached for bread, and brought it gently to his chest. The kettle hissed behind them. A blackbird called from the tree. She leaned into him finally. That night, they buried the rifle behind the cabin, not out of fear, but as a gesture, a line drawn between before and after. The earth was dry and stubborn, but they took turns. She wiped the sweat from his brow when he paused. He handed her water without words. They didn't celebrate. They didn't smile. But when they sat on the porch under a sky scattered with stars, her head rested against his shoulder. His arm wrapped around her quietly. The cabin stood strong behind them. The land wabao, as still. And for the first time in either of their lives, silence no longer meant danger. It meant peace. The seasons turned without asking. Spring softened the hard dirt around the cabin, and with it, wildflowers began to push through the cracks. She planted a garden, not because they needed food, but because she wanted to see something grow. Tomatoes, onions, marigolds. Elijah built her a fence around it, his hands rough, but his touch careful. She began to laugh again, though rarely, and always with one hand over her mouth like it still surprised her. They never spoke much of that day. The rifle remained buried beneath the sycamore, its spot marked only by a pile of smooth white stones she gathered herself. Once a year she knelt there, not in grief, but in quiet thanks. Elijah took to carving. Small things at first. A wooden sparrow. A box with a music crank that didn't work, but spun in her hands anyway. In the evenings they sat by the fire with no need for words. She would read aloud sometimes, slow and steady, and he would listen as if her voice was the only sound the world needed to keep spinning. Sometimes riders passed by the road beyond the hill, but none came near again. The girl, no longer a girl, walked freely through the town when needed, her head unbowed. The baker handed her bread without charge. No one asked about the ribbon she now wore in her hair instead of on her wrist. Peace didn't come all at once, but it stayed. And in that quiet place, carved out of pain and defiance, two people who had once been forgotten by the world began to belong, not just to each other, but to themselves. Years later, when strangers would ride past and see the smoke from their chimney curling into the dusk, they'd say the place felt watched over, protected. And though no one else knew why, those who listened closely would sometimes hear the sound of a kettle boiling and a fire crackling, and the soft hush of two people sitting close, not speaking, just surviving. Together, somewhere between the hunger and the bullet, they found something that could not be taken.